Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam, ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Uh, I'm wondering if you all have ever wondered if Muslims should vote. What does Islam say about voting in general and engaging in the voting process? How does that intersect with our lives today as Muslims in America? And so I wanted to welcome everyone today to our virtual Jummah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So I felt compelled to do some research on this topic because of the fact that one, I used to work as a congressional staffer. I volunteered on a campaign in Virginia for governor. I used to also be a care staffer as well. And part of my master's education was or graduate education was getting a master's in Christian Muslim relations as part of it, and studying Christianity in different and for institutions, right? And alhamdulillah, being a student of Islamic knowledge, may Allah accept as well. And so I wanted to kind of take all of this experience and put it into the Jummah for today. Now, first thing I wanted to talk about was the issue of the progressive and orthodox, or progressive and conservative, right? Movements or parties, and where did this originate from? So it's actually originated from the French government. When the French Revolution occurred, that was seen as the progressive movement away from the establishment, which was the church, which was elitism, which was the monarchy, the kings. So the idea was that kings were ordained by God. So you had to obey the kings, who were subsequently, by proxy, God's command, right? And so that whole ethos of kings and monarchy and elitism, colonialism even, became the conservative way, right? So when you want to say, I want to hold to conservative values, one is really saying, I want to hold to these Christian values, okay? And more elite values, right? And so what happened is that you went from the kings and the monarchies, elitism, into colonialism. These are also this mentality also used in the Crusades as well. And then in the post-colonial era, we as Americans, because we were formerly formerly run by the British, right? We also adopted and indoctrinated a lot of those values. So the Republican Party effectively and essentially became that current manifestation of those kings and the monarchy and conservative movements. And the fluidity, it changed, obviously. Then we had the neocons, which were the Bush Cheney kind of era. And then now we have Trump land, right? And so generally speaking, it's a very Christian movement. It's a very white Christian way of thinking to retain those Protestant Christian values. Now, on the Democratic side, you have the kind of pushing away from religion, pushing away from establishment, kind of Robin Hooding, right? Taking from the rich, giving to the poor. Everything goes. Woodstock, hippies, right? And then further indulging in risk-taking behaviors, supporting of minorities more, being more inclusive, opening the gates of immigration, right? And so this kind of became the ethos of the Democratic or liberal or progressive parties, right? And so if you want to take the worst of both worlds, then you have like Game of Thrones, right? Game of Thrones would be like the worst of both of these kinds of worlds, which would make America really bad, right? And so now I wanted to kind of segue into voting in Islamic history, right? So do we have any types of of voting precedents in Islam. Well, when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, his companions came to the ultimately collective decision to assign Abu Bakr as the new leader of the Muslims. And then when the third leader was appointed, Umar bin al-Khattab, who was the second Khalifa, he assigned a small group to decide who would become the next Khalifa. Okay, so that was a majority vote for the leader. Now, when you also look at in Abyssinia, when Najashi was going to be, was running for office, or was hoping running for office still, and then his family member was also trying to run for office, right? But his family member was going to kick out the Muslims, and Najashi was going to host the Muslims and keep them, safe in his land. So the Muslims supported Najashi to stay a leader in Abyssinia, and ultimately he was, right. Then the question also arises: can Muslims participate in campaign elections? So we have the example of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where he would ransom or bail out prisoners of war. And so there was a fatwa, or Islamic edicts, basically, through qiyas, which is analogy. The Prophet ﷺ gave money to free the Muslims from the Quraysh, non-Muslims of Quraysh, to secure the rights of the Muslims. And the Quraysh at the time were actively killing Muslims. So then what do you say about people who aren't doing that much evil, as much evil, but they are still doing some good for the Muslim community? And this incident is recorded in Sahih Bukhari. Okay, so now then we have the question of, should Muslims run for office, right, and be in office? So in this, we have the example of Yusuf alayhi salam, right, which is an evidence not to only run for office, but to nominate oneself even in a non-Muslim majority country. And we find this evidence in Surah Yusuf. And it's important to understand that Yusuf wasn't running in an Islamic majority country, right? He was wanting to be the minister of finance, so to speak, of Egypt. And so he said, قَالَ جَعَلْنِي عَلَى خَزَائِنِ الْأَرْضِ إِنِّي حَفِيظٌ عَلِيمٌ. So appoint me over the storehouses of the land. Indeed, I will be a knowing guardian. Okay, so this is the evidence that many of the scholars use today to say that one can run for office, and one can even nominate oneself for office. Okay, so that's very important for us to and in a non-Muslim majority land. Okay, so then we can go into the next topic, inshallah. And we have to also remember, on this point, that Yusuf alayhi salam was he was a prophet of God, So the prophets have different relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where they're getting, wahi, and they're getting, they're held to a higher standard. So it's very important to kind of keep that in mind. Now, the Prophet ﷺ himself manifested multiple examples of diplomacy in his prophethood. For example, in the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he negotiated without compromising for the benefit of the Muslim community. Even though it seemed to be an initial defeat, it was a step towards a complete victory. Another salient example is when the Prophet ﷺ established the Charter of Medina, where he stated that Jews and Muslims are one ummah, are one community. The Prophet ﷺ also mentioned that he would have partaken in Hilf al-Fudul, which was a political pact that protected the rights of visitors to Mecca from larceny, showing that non-Muslims running social justice-oriented projects were a retroactive sunnah, as long as they were not, contradicting the ethos of Islam. Now, in the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, we have the concept of maslaha mursala, which is the public interest, right? So, for example, the companions, Sahaba radhiyallahu anhum, they decided to use currency to establish prisons and impose tax on agricultural lands in the conquered territories despite the fact that no textual authority could be found in favor of this. And we also have the principle of dropping the lesser of two evils, okay? And so this is very important for us to also understand, right? There's two evils. For example, somebody, you're dying in the desert, all you have is like pork, you can eat the pork, right? Pork is still haram, but at that moment, it's a lesser of two evils, and you're allowed to eat the pork to preserve your life, right? So that's also something that I wanted to mention. And then the maxims of Islamic jurisprudence, the Qawa'id al-Fiqh, we have the principle that harm must be eliminated, okay? So it's incumbent upon people of good moral conscience, such in our hearts and minds and souls, to utilize our voice by voting, contributing, and participating in elections. The Prophet ﷺ also mentioned that whoever among you sees evil, let them change it with their hands. If they are unable to do so, then with their tongue. If they are unable to do so, then with their heart. And that is the weakest level of faith. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Ali Imran, in the 3rd Surah, 104th ayah, to be a community that calls for what is good, urges what is right, and forbids what is wrong. Those who do this are the successful ones. Okay? And Allah also says in 13th Surah, 11th ayah, indeed, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. Now, we also have the science of maqasid al-sharia, and that is the protection of religion, or the main objectives, religion, life, intellect, progeny, and wealth, okay? And there are so many ulama, so many scholars, so many people of spiritual leadership who have endorsed voting, Dr. Ingrid Mattson, Dr. Asif al-Quraishi Landes, Dr. Syed Mustafa al-Qazwini, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Imam Siraj Wahad, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayat, Imam Suhaib Webb, Imam Umar Suleiman, Dr. Yasir Qadi, Imam Nadzaku. So I want to highlight some of these scholars and reasoning, but especially I want to highlight Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, who has passed away, a super scholar from Medina, that he said that it is wajib, meaning it is mandatory for Muslims to vote. And he uses the evidence in the first 4 ayat of Surah Al-Rum, where the Romans Christians had defeated the Persians, who were not of the Ahl al-Kitab, and so because the Christians were closer to Islam, this is the principle of dropping lesser of two evils. Okay. Now, Sheikh al-Qaradawi, who was a very famous scholar in Sham region, he said that voting with the legal testimony, it equates like a legal testimony from a witness, right? So the voter is obligated to furnish testimony supporting the trustworthy and competent candidate, as opposed to the most unqualified and corrupt ones. Okay. Now, what are the concerns about voting? Now, we have to kind of stay objective here as we can and kind of give both sides of the story, so to speak, right? So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in Sahih Muslim that whoever initiates or revives a good deed in Islam, he gets its reward. And the reward granted to anyone who does it after him without reducing the reward of the doer himself. And whoever establishes a bad deed in Islam, they bear the burden and the burden of anyone who does it after them, without reducing anything from the doer's sin. Okay, so that's an authentic hadith of Prophet ﷺ. So some people are hesitant, rightfully so, to vote because they would be partaking in electing someone who could potentially cause harm to other people domestically or nationally. And usually it's the underprivileged and the weaker, which is valid. If it would happen with the Clinton administration, we have the war on drugs that led to mass incarcerations. With Bush Jr., we had the post 9/11 comprehensive attack on American Muslims and Muslims globally through waterboarding, profiling, FBI raids, tortures at Guantanamo, countless hate crimes that even extended to the Sikh community, and unjust war in Iraq with 0 weapons of mass destruction. In President Obama, we had the hope. We also got doped by the Muslim majorities countries that he bombed. And President Trump, we got a Muslim ban white supremacist activism, empowerment, and basically everybody except for rich white men, straight men, was getting totally played, right? So we can understand the validity of hesitancy to vote, right? We also have the concern of Maududi, Sayyid Qutb, big name ulama who have also had the concern because you are supporting ruling, um, other than the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then we find many variants of this in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, the 5th surah, the 45th ayah. Allah says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. So Allah says, whoever does not judge by what Allah has revealed, then it is those who are the wrongdoers, ظالمون. Okay, so this is important to kind of take into consideration both sides when we're discussing any kind of issue, right? Now, even in Muslim majority countries, you'll find that there's corruption happening with the election process. It's not fair. You can look it up in Malaysia, for example. It's a great case study of how they have unfair elections. Even in the States, we have some problems with the electoral college and voter repression, and there are definitely some issues that are happening right now, voter privilege. Now, we also want to take into consideration that we do live in a non-Muslim majority country, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah in the 256th ayah, La ikraha fi din, there's no compulsion in the religion. So we cannot force anyone to obey the Islamic law or to obey the Sharia, contrary to what Islamophobes will say, okay? And there is no such thing, if you look at it globally, as a 100% Muslim majority country. It doesn't exist, knee-jerk reaction, oh, Saudi Arabia. No, they're not. Like, the people who graduate from University of Saudi Arabia will tell you that they do half of the Islamic law, so to speak, right? And we also have Muslim majority countries like Turkey attacking Syria, Saudi attacking Yemen, that are also, evidence of just like the idealistic, utopic hope of having Muslim majority countries and Muslims running by 100% Islamic law is a beautiful aspiration, but it is not what's happening today, right? Now, but again, I want to go back to the point that there is evil in it, right? But it's a lesser of two evils. Okay, that's kind of what I'm trying to convey right now. Now, are Muslims Republicans or Democrats, right? Should we be Republicans or Democrats, right? Now, the research shows that Muslims are mostly Democrat or independent, okay, and get fringes on both sides, right? And ideologically, we are mostly moderate or liberal, okay? And now the question arises, is that including the Black Muslim community, right? Now, what's important to also understand is that, so the Black community, including the Black Muslim community, has been Democrat for a long time, but it wasn't always the case. In the early mid 20th century, the Black community was Republican. And this is according to house.gov, right? Was Republican, and then they moved to being Democrat, right? So you see some fluidity in that movement. You also see with the Muslim community, I think outside of the Black Muslim community, you'll find that there was a vast majority that were Republican. And then after 9/11, the vast majority became Democrat, right? So you see that fluidity of both the Black Muslim community, because of the Black community in general, and because of the migrant or national Muslim community also moving to the Democratic side, which is very fascinating, right? I think there was an aspiration of whiteness in that, wanting to assimilate into the white community, to the white suburbs, that white kind of echelon class, but then ultimately realizing that white privilege was specifically for white Christians, right? And so the Muslims have had one of the lowest voter turnouts compared to other faith groups. But the good news is that we're getting better at volunteering, donating, and voting. These are all turning up, and we are very supportive of progressive and inclusive issues like Black Lives Matter and so forth, right? And it's also important for us to say that we should be supporting Muslim candidates on every level, locally, statewide, nationally, whatever, and not just the ones of our ethnicity. So if there are Muslim candidates who are not of your ethnicity, you should still be supporting them, and not someone who's of your ethnicity who's not Muslim, right? That's a strong component of jahiliyyah, of ignorance. It's not Islamic to do that, right? That ethnocentrism is not Islamic, or ethnocentricity. So Al-Qardawi suggests that, as I mentioned before, that witness is that voting is equivalent to being a witness. So take some time to research your candidates or understand what's happening if you can. If you don't know, you don't have to vote on a certain kind of city council or something like that, right? Now, what's also important to understand in our own American history is that African Americans in the beginning of our history could not vote, neither could non-property holders, and neither could women. And 3/4 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. And only 6% of adults were eligible to vote when the first president was elected. So that wasn't a majority. This is from Dr. Michael Eric Dyson, sociologist in Georgetown. And 15 to 30% of the Africans who were forced into slavery, this is according to Khalid Baidoun at Wayne State University Law, were Muslim, right? So a good majority of them are Muslim. Now, there are also, one time I was at a meeting with former Congressman Keith Ellison, who was the first Muslim congressman. He had mentioned that, you can be a person of faith and a faith leader and still cause effective change into politics. You don't have to actually be the person running. You can cause it from the outside. MLK, Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, he lobbied for the Civil Rights Act, which ultimately of 1964, right? So you need people of faith to be involved and to be involved in this process to make sure that politicians are held into account and there is a movement that is happening there, right? So with all of that, in conclusion, it seems, and Allah knows best, that Muslims should be voting, should be mindful of the parties and the candidates, and it's not a 100% unfortunately utopic process and ethical and clear and clean process, but it is a lesser of two evils, seemingly, and we got to do our best to make sure that we got candidates in office that are supportive of our community and supportive of those who are the marginalized, as Allah has mentioned many times in the Quran, even the fifth pillar of Islam, to give zakah. The people who get zakah are the ones who are marginalized, and that's who the progressive values are promoting to protect and to help the poor and the misakin, the fuqara, the people who are needy, the orphans, yatim, and so forth, right? Victims of sex trafficking. So this is all part of what Islam teaches, right? To be inclusive and be supportive of minorities and progressive values, and get people in office that will do more good than harm. Okay, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Thank you for your time. Hopefully, please do go out and vote. I did my voter registration from California. I'm in Texas right now. I got the mail in. I filled it out. I signed it. I dated it. I put it back in the mail. Contactless. It was very safe. Alhamdulillah. So please get your families to vote. Get your friends to vote, and let's have some positive outcomes, inshallah, on the election day. Take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you for your time.